In the year 1180, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem was an anomaly, a sliver of Western feudalism clinging precariously to the hostile shores of the Levant. Founded in the furious wake of the First Crusade, it was a land of staggering contrasts. Immense wealth flowed from European pilgrims and Eastern trade, but its very existence was a perpetual state of siege. The Crusader nobility, having grown soft and decadent over generations, had settled into an uneasy, often profitable, truce with their Muslim neighbors. But beneath the surface of courtly politics and grand tournaments, the kingdom was rotting, weakened by internal feuds, personal ambition, and a fatal impending flaw: a dying king. The stability of the kingdom rested on the shoulders of King Baldwin IV, a man known simply and tragically as the Leper King. Baldwin IV was crowned in 1174 at the age of 13. He was charismatic, intelligent, highly educated, and possessed a natural authority that commanded respect. But he was afflicted by an incurable, agonizing disease. Leprosy. The signs of the disease first appeared as numbness in his right arm. As his reign progressed, the disease ravaged his body, forcing him to wear a mask to conceal the destruction on his face. He suffered constant, intense pain. Despite his failing body, Baldwin was an extraordinary monarch and a brilliant military commander. He understood the precarious balance of power. His kingdom was a minority state, surviving only because its Muslim enemies were divided. His policy was one of cautious aggression, relying on strategic alliances and short, decisive campaigns that leveraged the shock power of the Western Knights. His greatest triumph, achieved at the age of 16, was the Battle of Montgisard, 1177, where he led a charge of a few hundred knights to utterly rout the vast army of the rising Muslim leader, Saladin. But Baldwin's deteriorating health was a ticking clock. His inevitable death created a power vacuum, forcing the kingdom to grapple with the terrifying question: who will hold the gates when the king can no longer ride? Baldwin's illness fractured the court into two irreconcilable factions, each vying for influence and the eventual regency. The moderates, the Ibelins Tripoli. This faction was led by Reynald III of Tripoli, a shrewd, seasoned statesman and the most powerful native-born baron. They favored diplomacy, honoring truces, and a pragmatic alliance with the Byzantines, and even some neighboring Muslim states to ensure the kingdom's long-term survival. They were focused on defense and stability. The Hawks, the Knights Châtillon. This aggressive, uncompromising faction was composed of recent arrivals from Europe, obsessed with expansion and religious purity. They were led by the king's mother, Agnes of Courtenay, and most disastrously, the ruthless adventurer, Reynald of Châtillon. They favored constant, aggressive warfare and confrontation, regardless of the strategic consequences. This internal, personal rivalry was the fatal flaw of the Latin Kingdom. It consumed the last years of Baldwin's life, preventing the united front necessary to face the gathering storm. The struggle for succession centered on finding a husband for Baldwin's sister Sibylla. The moderates favored a strong, reliable European prince. The Hawks, however, chose the man who would prove to be the most strategically inept leader in Crusader history, Guy of Lusignan. Guy was handsome, but weak, arrogant, and politically naive. He was brought to the Levant by the Hawks and married to Sibylla purely to cement their power. Baldwin IV, who recognized Guy's fatal incompetence, eventually removed him as regent, but the damage was done. When the dying Baldwin needed to secure his succession, he was forced to rely on the unstable marriage. The power struggle reached its climax with the king's final decision. Recognizing that he could no longer lead and knowing Guy was unfit, Baldwin named Reynald of Tripoli as regent for the young heir. Baldwin V, he was trying to buy the kingdom time, placing the cautious statesman in command. Baldwin IV, the warrior king, who fought battles while blind and mutilated by his disease, died in 1185 at the age of 24. His death removed the only figure capable of commanding both the respect of the nobility and the fear of Saladin. The brief reign of the child Baldwin V ended a year later, leaving the throne vacant. Through a swift, illegal coup d'etat orchestrated by the Hawks, Guy of Lusignan was crowned King of Jerusalem, and his belligerent wife Sibylla placed the crown on his head. The moderates were sidelined. The aggressive Hawks were in command. The fate of the kingdom was now in the hands of the most reckless, ambitious, and incompetent faction. The most dangerous man now operating under the protection of King Guy was the Hawk faction's strongest military commander, Reynald of Châtillon. Reynald was a relic of the First Crusade, ferocious, greedy adventurer who had spent 16 years imprisoned in a Muslim jail and returned with an uncompromising thirst for vengeance and gold. He had acquired the formidable fortress of Kerak, giving him control over the major trade and pilgrimage routes south of the Dead Sea. Reynald was a man of action who respected no treaty, saw no strategic necessity in truce, and cared only for plunder and his own reputation. He was an existential threat to the peace Raymond of Tripoli had carefully negotiated. Reynald's repeated, audacious acts of piracy attacking wealthy Muslim trade and pilgrimage caravans that relied on the truce were not mere banditry. They were direct, intentional acts of strategic sabotage, aimed at provoking the one man who had successfully unified the Muslim world against the fragile Crusader states. Saladin. The stage for the ultimate catastrophe was set. A reckless hawk. On the frontier, a unified Muslim enemy dedicated to jihad, and a kingdom led by a politically inept king. The final fatal truce was about to be broken by a single, brutal act of piracy. While the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem consumed itself with petty succession crises and greed, a very different kind of power was coalescing in the deserts beyond. The River Jordan. His name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, but history knows him by his honorific title, Salah ad-Din, the righteousness of the faith, or simply Saladin. Saladin was not born to royalty. He was a Kurd, born in Tikrit, in modern-day Iraq, an outsider in a military hierarchy dominated by Turks and Arabs. He began his career not as a conqueror, but as a dutiful lieutenant to his uncle, Shirkuh, serving under the great Syrian ruler, Nur ad-Din. In his youth, Saladin showed little sign of the ascetic holy warrior he would become. He loved wine, poetry, and the company of scholars. But destiny intervened in 1169, when he was sent to Egypt to shore up the crumbling Fatimid Caliphate against Crusader incursions. Through a series of brilliant political maneuvers and sudden deaths, the young Saladin found himself the vizier of Egypt. When the Fatimid Caliph died, Saladin abolished the Shia Caliphate and proclaimed the return of Sunni orthodoxy, effectively seizing control of the wealthiest province in the Near East. When his nominal master, Nur ad-Din, died in 1174, the Muslim world threatened to fracture into civil war. Saladin moved with decisive speed. He did not just hold Egypt. He marched his army out of the Nile Delta and into Syria, seizing Damascus without a fight. In that moment, the strategic map of the Middle East changed forever. For nearly 80 years, the Crusader states had survived because their enemies were divided. The centers of Muslim power, Cairo, Egypt, Damascus, Syria, and Aleppo, northern Syria, were ruled by rival dynasties who spent more time fighting each other than fighting the Christians. Saladin shattered this status quo by unifying Egypt and Syria under a single banner, the Ayyubid dynasty. He created a massive, continuous empire that geographically encircled the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusaders were no longer a wedge driving Muslim powers apart. They were now an island surrounded by a rising tide. Saladin controlled the grain of Egypt, the trade wealth of Damascus, and the manpower of the Syrian plains. He spent a decade patiently bringing the chaotic local emirs to heel, using a blend of diplomacy, force, and the powerful rhetoric of jihad. Saladin was not merely a warlord seeking territory. He was a true believer. Following a serious illness that nearly killed him, he underwent a profound spiritual awakening. He renounced wine and the pleasures of the court, dedicating his life entirely to the holy war. To Saladin, the presence of the Franks, Crusaders in the Holy Land, was a spiritual pollution. Jerusalem al-Quds was the third holiest site in Islam, the place from which the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. Its occupation by Christians was an intolerable insult to God. He successfully branded himself not as a king, but as the champion of Islam. He utilized the concept of jihad to unify the disparate tribes of Kurds, Turks, Arabs, and Bedouins. He preached that their internal squabbles were sins that allowed the infidel to occupy their lands. His reputation for chivalry and justice became his greatest weapon. Unlike the brutal Reynald of Châtillon, Saladin was known to keep his word. He was generous to his enemies, often releasing captives and treating fierce opponents with respect. This earned him the grudging admiration of the Christian nobility, who saw in him the mirror image of their own chivalric ideals, a Christian knight in all but faith. But this chivalry masked a cold, strategic resolve. Saladin was patient. He was willing to sign truces, like the one negotiated with Raymond of Tripoli, to buy time while he gathered his strength. He knew that the Franks were few and could not be reinforced, while his own reservists were limitless. By 1186, Saladin's consolidation was complete. He had secured Aleppo and Mosul. He was now the undisputed master of the Muslim Near East. He possessed a professional corps army of Mamluk slave soldiers trained from boyhood to be elite heavy cavalry, supported by vast numbers of light cavalry archers and volunteer zealots. Seeking martyrdom. He moved his massive army to the borders of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, probing for weakness. He did not want a chaotic brawl. He wanted a decisive battle that would wipe out the Frankish field army in one stroke. He knew that the Crusaders' greatest weakness was their heavy armor in the heat of the desert. Saladin needed a provocation, a clear, undeniable breach of the truce that would justify a total invasion in the eyes of the Muslim world and allow him to call upon every emir for troops. He watched the Latin kingdom tear itself apart over the succession of King Guy. He watched the reckless raids of Reynald of Châtillon with a simmering, calculated fury. Saladin was a coiled spring, holding back the immense pressure of the unified Islamic world, waiting for the Crusaders to make one fatal mistake. And in the fortress of Kerak, the reckless Baron Reynald was about to give him exactly what he needed. In the medieval mind, there were three distinct orders of men: those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. The genius and the terror of the Crusades was that it smashed the first two categories together. The result was the military order, men who took the monks' vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but who replaced the quill and the plow with the lance and the sword. Foremost among them were the poor, fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, better known as the Knights Templar. By 1187, the Templars were no longer the 9 poor knights patrolling the pilgrim roads on charity. They had evolved into the first true standing army of the Western world since the Ramang legions. They were a multinational corporation of war, answering to no king, only to the Pope. To the average Muslim soldier, the Frange nobility were terrifying enough, but the Templars were something else entirely. They were the devils in white. They did not fight for land or booty or feudal obligation. They fought for the sheer, fanatical destruction of the enemies of Christ. The power of the Templars lay in their discipline. In an age where European armies were chaotic gatherings of individual knights seeking personal glory, the Templars fought as a single, cohesive machine. Their Latin rule, drafted by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, governed every aspect of their lives. They ate in silence. They slept in their shirts and breeches, ready to fight at a moment's notice. They were forbidden from hunting, hawking, or gambling. Their only purpose was war, On the battlefield, they were forbidden to retreat unless outnumbered by more than 3-1. To break formation was to be expelled from the order of fate worse than death. This discipline made their heavy cavalry charge the most devastating weapon in the Middle East. When the Templars lowered their lances and charged, they struck with the weight of a collapsing mountain. Saladin respected the secular barons. He could ransom them, negotiate with them, or reason with them. But he feared and hated the military orders, both the Templars and the Hospitallers. He knew they could not be bought. He knew they would never stop fighting. And so Saladin had a standing policy regarding the Templars: no ransom, no mercy, only execution. By 1187, the leadership of this terrifying organization had fallen into the hands of a man who embodied the worst excesses of the Crusader spirit. His name was Gerard de Riedfort, the Grand Master of the Temple. Gerard was not a man of the Holy Land. He was a Flemish adventurer who had arrived late to the East, hungry for status. He was arrogant, impetuous, and consumed by a burning hatred for the moderate faction of the kingdom, specifically Reynald of Tripoli, whom he viewed as a traitor for negotiating truces with Muslims. Gerard threw the immense weight of the Templars behind the Hawk faction. It was Gerard who had helped engineer the coup that put the weak Guy of Lusignan on the throne. It was Gerard who poured the Templars' vast wealth into the royal treasury to buy Guy's loyalty. Gerard de Riedfort believed in the divine right of the charge. He despised tactics, caution, and diplomacy. His philosophy was simple: God wills it. If the cause was just, God would grant victory, regardless of the odds or the terrain. This belief, while spiritually potent, was militarily suicidal. While their vows spoke of poverty, the order itself was staggeringly wealthy. The Templars had invented modern banking. A pilgrim could deposit gold at the Temple Church in London, receive a coded letter of credit, and withdraw the funds in Jerusalem. They owned 9,000 manors across Europe, a vast fleet of ships, and massive fortresses in the Holy Land. This wealth meant they were the only force in the Kingdom of Jerusalem that could afford to maintain heavy horses, purchase the finest steel, armor from Milan, and keep a standing force of mercenaries, Turcopoles, to support their knights. In the crumbling Latin kingdom, where the king was often broke and the barons were squabbling over taxes, the Templars were the financial and military anchor. This gave Grand Master Gerard de Riedfort dangerous political leverage. When he spoke, the king had to listen, because without the Templars, the king had no army. As Saladin gathered his forces in Damascus, the Templars were restless. They sat in their great fortresses La Fave Saft and their headquarters on the Temple Mount, sharpening their swords and chanting their prayers. They wore white mantles symbolized purity, emblazoned with displayed red cross of martyrdom. They were the shock troops of Christendom, convinced of their own invincibility, but their strength was brittle. There were only perhaps 300 to 600 full Templar brother knights in the entire Kingdom of Jerusalem at any given time, supported by sergeants and secular knights. They were a razor-thin elite. If they were wiped out in a single day, there were no reserves to replace them. Under the reckless leadership of Gerard de Riedfort, this elite force was a weapon aimed not just at the enemy, but unwittingly at the heart of the kingdom itself. They were eager for the truce to break. They were eager for the chance to destroy the armies of Islam. And thanks to the actions of their ally, Reynald of Châtillon, they were about to get exactly what they prayed for. If King Baldwin IV was the shield of the kingdom and Raymond of Tripoli was its brain, then Reynald of Châtillon was its rabid, uncontrollable ID. Reynald was an anomaly, even among the violent men of his age. A minor French noble with no inheritance, he had come to the Holy Land on the Second Crusade and stayed to carve out a personal empire built on blood and audacity. He was a man of immense physical charm, terrifying cruelty, and absolute fearlessness. After spending 16 years rotting in Muslim dungeon in Aleppo, a captivity that would have broken a lesser man. He emerged not humbled, but filled with a cold, burning hatred for Islam. He married the wealthy heiress Stephanie of Millie, gaining control of the vast lordship of Altri-Jordan, Transjordan. Crucially, this lordship came with the crown jewel of the frontier, the fortress of Kerak. Kerak was a strategic nightmare for the Muslim world. Perched on a high ridge east of the Dead Sea, it physically dominated the King's Highway, the vital artery connecting Saladin's two power bases, Damascus and Cairo. From the high walls of Kerak, Reynald could look down like a wolf watching a flock of sheep. He had his hands around the throat of the Islamic economy, to understand why Saladin hated Reynald above all other men. One must look at the audacious raid of 1182. Bored with simple banditry, Reynald had hauled timber across the desert, built a fleet of pirate ships on the shores of the Red Sea, and launched a campaign of terror that shocked the Islamic world. He didn't just raid trade ships. He aimed for the heart of the faith. His pirates attacked the pilgrim ports leading to Mecca and Medina. He ravaged the unprotected coasts, sinking pilgrim ships and burning villages. It was an act of sacrilege so profound that it sent tremors through every court in the Near East. Saladin's brother eventually crushed the pirate fleet, but Reynald escaped. The message, however, was clear. As long as Reynald of Châtillon lived, the holiest sites of Islam were not safe. By 1186, the wise regent, Raymond of Tripoli, had negotiated a fragile 4-year truce with Saladin. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was weak, bankrupt, and badly needed peace to recover. Trade began to flow again. Muslim caravans moved cautiously between Cairo and Damascus, paying tolls to the Christian lords for safe passage. Saladin, busy consolidating his northern borders in Mosul, adhered strictly to the truce. He respected the law of treaties, but Reynald of Châtillon recognized no truce made with infidels. To him, a treaty was merely a pause in the killing, a sign of Christian weakness. He sat in Kerak, watching the dust clouds of the wealthy caravans passing below his walls, his greed warring with the king's peace. In the winter of 1186 to 1187, temptation arrived in the form of a massive target. A gargantuan caravan was making its way up from Cairo to Damascus. It was vast, protected by a light military escort, and laden with spices, gold, silks, and armor. Rumors that have echoed through history that among the passengers was Saladin's own sister, returning from the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. While historians debate her presence, the symbolism of the target was undeniable. This was the wealth of the East, passing right under Reynald's nose. It was too much for the Wolf of Kerak, defying the direct orders of King Guy, defying the truce, and defying the laws of chivalry. Reynald rode out from Kerak with his knights. Attack was swift and brutal. The caravan's guards were overwhelmed. The merchants and pilgrims were stripped of their goods. Those who resisted were slaughtered. The rest were dragged in chains back to the dungeons of Kerak. When the captive merchants reminded Reynald of the truce signed by the King of Jerusalem, Reynald reportedly sneered, "Let your Muhammad come and deliver you." News of the atrocity reached Damascus swiftly. Saladin was incandescent with rage. But ever the statesman, he followed the proper diplomatic channels first. He sent envoys to King Guy of Lusignan in Jerusalem, demanding two things: the immediate release of the captives and the return of the goods. Compensation for the violation of the truce. King Guy, terrified of provoking a war he knew he couldn't win, agreed. He sent a desperate command to Reynald: return the loot, free the prisoners, obey your king. Reynald's response was the defining moment of the era's politics. He sent the king's messengers back with a flat refusal. "I am lord in my land," Reynald declared, "just as he is lord in his." It was a breathtaking act of insubordination. It revealed to Saladin and to the world that the king of Jerusalem had no control over his own barons. The kingdom was not a state. It was a chaotic collection of warring warlords. When Saladin heard of Reynald's refusal, and specifically the insult to the prophet, his demeanor changed. The calculating politician vanished. The avenging holy warrior took his place. According to the chroniclers, Saladin swore a solemn oath before God. If the Lord grants me victory over this man, I will kill him with my own hand. The time for diplomacy was over. The truce was dead. Reynald of Châtillon had given Saladin the moral high ground he needed to unite the entire Muslim world for a final, decisive strike. Saladin sent the call out to every corner of his empire, from the Nile to the Tigris. He summoned the jihad. The armies of Islam began to converge not for a raid, but for a war of annihilation. And in Jerusalem, the divided, squabbling Christian lords slowly realized the horror of what Reynald had done. He had kicked the lion awake, and now, the lion was coming for them all. Asterisk in the spring of 1187, the call to jihad echoed from the minarets of Cairo to the mountains of Mosul. Saladin was no longer negotiating. He was assembling an avalanche. He emptied his garrisons. He called upon the governors of his farthest provinces. He summoned the heavy cavalry of the Mamluks, the fierce Kurdish lancers, the Turkish horse archers, and thousands of Mutatawiya religious volunteers seeking martyrdom. They converged on Tel Ashtara, a staging ground south of Damascus. The chroniclers described the army as a sea of steel. It numbered some 30,000 men, including 12,000 regular cavalry. It was the largest Muslim army the Crusader states had ever faced. Saladin's plan was clear. He would not waste time besieging the formidable castles of Kerak or Montreal. He would bypass them and strike directly at the heart of the kingdom. He intended to cross the River Jordan south of the Sea of Galilee and force the Christian army into a field battle, a battle where his superior numbers and mobility would be decisive. But across the border, the Christian leadership remained dangerously fractured. King Guy was in Jerusalem, while Reynald of Tripoli, the most capable strategist, remained in his own territory. Technically still in a truce with Saladin, refusing to acknowledge Guy as king, the kingdom was fighting itself while the executioner sharpened his axe. It was the Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Riedfort, who unwittingly forced the Christians to unite by leading them into a massacre. On May 1st, 1187, Saladin sent a large reconnaissance force of some 7,000 cavalry into Galilee to scout the land. They were under strict orders to return by sunset. Gerard de Riedfort, resting at a Templar castle nearby with a small force, heard reports of the Muslim incursion. With him was the Grand Master of the Hospitallers, Roger de Moulins, and a handful of knights, perhaps 130 men in total. The Hospitaller Master urged caution, pointing out they were outnumbered 50 to 1. Gerard, true to his fanaticism, sneered at him, reportedly asking if he loved his blonde head too much to lose it. Stung by the insult to his honor, the Hospitaller agreed to ride. They caught up with the 7,000 Muslim cavalry at the springs of Cresson. A rational commander would have retreated. Gerard ordered a charge. The result was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Muslim cavalry simply enveloped the tiny Crusader force. The Hospitaller Grand Master was killed instantly. The Templars were wiped out. Only 3 knights escaped alive. One of them, miraculously and suspiciously, was Gerard de Riedfort. The Battle of Cresson was a catastrophic waste of the kingdom's elite shock troops. But the shock of the massacre did what diplomacy could not. It terrified the Christian factions into unity. When news of the slaughter reached Reynald of Tripoli, he was horrified. He realized that his private truce with Saladin was no longer tenable. The war had arrived on his doorstep. Reynald rode to meet King Guy at the castle of St. Job in Jerusalem. In a dramatic public ceremony, the two rivals reconciled. Reynald knelt before Guy, creating a unified front for the first time in years. King Guy then issued the Ari ban, The total summons of the feudal host. Every able-bodied man in the Kingdom of Jerusalem was called to arms. Every castle and city was stripped of its garrison to swell the ranks of the field army. Money poured from the Templar vaults to hire mercenaries. The army that gathered at the springs of Sepphoris in late June was the largest the kingdom had ever assembled. 1,200 knights, 4,000 light cavalry, and perhaps 15,000 foot soldiers. It was a magnificent force, the full strength of the Latin East, but it was also a brittle one. If this army was lost, there were no reserves. The castles behind them were empty, the cities were unguarded. They had put every chip they had on the table for one roll of the dice. Saladin watched the Christians gather at Sephoria. He knew the terrain perfectly. Sephoria was a strong position, well-watered and defensible. If the Christians stayed there, Saladin could not attack them without risking disaster. He needed to draw them out. He needed to lure them away from the water and into the scorching heat of the Galilean summer. July 2nd, 1187, Saladin played his card. He marched his army across the Jordan and laid siege to the city of Tiberias on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Tiberias belonged to Reynald of Tripoli. Inside the citadel, trapped by Saladin's forces, was Raymond's own wife, Esquiva of Bars. Saladin's message to the Christian army was brutal and simple. Come and fight me, or watch your regent's wife and city fall. He did not want the city. He wanted the army. He dug in his forces on the dry, dusty plateau between Sephoria and Tiberias, waiting to see if the Frange would take the bait. The stage was set for the most consequential council of war in the history of the Crusades. In the tent of King Guy, the fate of Jerusalem would be decided by a clash of egos, fear, and the terrible thirst of the desert. Asterisk on the night of July 2nd, 1187, the air in the king's tent at Sephoria was thick with heat and tension. Outside, 20,000 men camped around the precious springs, their fires flickering in the darkness. Inside, the barons of the Kingdom of Jerusalem gathered to decide the fate of the East. The news from Tiberias was dire. Saladin had breached the town walls. The citadel held out, but Lady Esquiva, the wife of Reynald of Tripoli, was trapped and sending desperate pleas for help. The strategic situation was brutally simple. The distance from their camp at Sephoria to Tiberias was about 15 miles 24 km. But those 15 miles lay across a barren, waterless plateau, baking under the fiercest heat of the Galilean summer. There were no springs between Sephoria and the Sea of Galilee. To march meant exposing the army to dehydration, exhaustion, and constant harassment by Saladin's archers, all before they even reached the main Muslim force. Reynald of Tripoli spoke first. As the most experienced commander and the man whose own wife was in danger, his words carried immense weight. He stood before the council and made a shocking, selfless plea. He urged the king not to march. "Sire," he reportedly said, "Tiberias is my city. My wife and children are there. But I would rather lose them all, and my city too, than lose the kingdom." Reynald argued that Saladin's army was too large to be defeated in the open field. He advised them to stay at Sephoria, where they had water and a strong defensive position. If they waited, Saladin, whose army was large and expensive to maintain, would eventually be forced to withdraw or attack them on their own ground, where the Christians would have the advantage. It was the counsel of a master strategist. Most of the barons, recognizing the wisdom of sacrificing the castle to save the army, agreed. King Guy accepted the advice. The order was given. The army would stand fast. The council broke up, and the barons returned to their tents to sleep, believing the crisis was averted. But the Hawk faction could not let it stand. In the dead of night, Gerard de Rydfort, the Grand Master of the Templars, crept back into the king's tent. Gerard despised Reynald. He viewed Reynald's caution as cowardice, or worse, treason. He whispered poison into the ear of the weak King Guy. He reminded the king that the English money used to raise the army had come from the Templars. He questioned the king's courage. "Do you wish to be known as the king who let a Christian lady fall to the Saracens while you sat safe in your tent?" Gerard asked. "Raymond is a traitor. He wants you to look weak so he can take your crown." 4. A man as insecure and indebted as Guy of Lusignan. These words were a knife in the ribs. He feared being seen as a coward more than he feared Saladin. Sometime before dawn, King Guy made the fatal decision. He reversed the council's ruling. He ordered the trumpets to sound. The army would march at dawn on July 3, 1187. The Crusader army moved out from the springs of Sepharia. Reynald of Tripoli, hearing the order, was aghast. He reportedly cried out, "Ah, Lord God, the war is over. We are dead men, the kingdom is finished." But as a vassal, he had no choice but to obey. Because his lands were the theater of war, feudal custom demanded he lead the vanguard. The column was massive, stretching for miles. The vanguard, led by Reynald of Tripoli. The center, led by King Guy, guarding the true cross, the holiest relic in Christendom, a piece of the actual cross of Christ, carried in a golden-cased box by the Bishop of Acre. The rear guard, led by Balian of Ibelin and the Templars, protecting the army from behind. As they left the green orchards of Sepharia and stepped onto the scorched, yellow grass of the plateau, they left their only source of water behind. The sun began to rise, a hammer of white heat beating down on men encased in heavy mail and padded gambesons. Saladin's scouts watched the Christians leave the springs. Saladin could hardly believe his luck. "What I wanted has come to pass," he is said to have exclaimed. He did not attack immediately with his heavy cavalry. Instead, he unleashed his horse archers. Thousands of light Turkish cavalry swarmed the flanks of the Crusader column. They rode in close, loosed arrows and wheeled away before the slow Christian knights could countercharge. They did not aim to kill the knights. The European armor was too thick. They aimed for the horses. A knight without a horse was slow, vulnerable, and exhausted. The march became a living hell. The heat was oppressive, soaring past 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius. The dust kicked up by thousands of feet choked the men. Arrows rained down constantly. By noon, the army had covered only half the distance to Tiberias. They were miles from water. Men began to faint. The infantry, desperate with thirst, began to panic. King Guy, realizing his men could not reach Tiberias that day, made his second fatal error. Instead of pushing through to the Sea of Galilee at all costs, or retreating to Sepharia, he ordered the army to halt and camp on the arid plateau of Libya. They were stopping in a waterless wasteland, surrounded by the enemy. Saladin's forces immediately encircled the Crusader camp. As night fell, the Muslims lit fires all around the Christian position. They were close enough that the Crusaders could hear the Muslim soldiers singing and cruelly pouring water onto the ground to taunt them. The smoke from the fires drifted into the Crusader camp, parching their throats even further. Within the Christian camp, morale collapsed. There was no water. The horses were dying. The leaders were arguing. Reynald of Tripoli knew that the next day would bring death. In the distance, rising from the plateau like two tombstones, stood the peaks of an extinct volcano. They were known as the Horns of Hattin. This would be the altar upon which the kingdom of Jerusalem would be sacrificed. The night of July 3, 1187, was arguably the longest in the history of the Crusades. 20,000 Christian soldiers lay fully armored on the hard, rocky ground of the Libya Plateau. They had marched for hours in the sun without water. Now in the darkness the temperature dropped, but the thirst remained annoying. Physical agony that swelled tongues and blurred vision. Surrounding them in a vast tightening ring were the campfires of Saladin's army. The Muslims were well supplied. Camel trains brought constant skins of water from the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River. Saladin, a master of psychological warfare, ordered his men to approach the Crusader lines under the cover of darkness. They didn't attack. They tormented. They poured precious water onto the parched earth within earshot of the dying Christians. They chanted prayers and beat drums, denying the exhausted Franks even a moment of sleep. Inside the royal tent, King Guy was paralyzed by indecision. The barons argued furiously, but the time for argument was gone. They were trapped in a kill box of their own making. Dawn broke on July 4th, 1187, a day that would live in infamy. The sun rose over the hills of Galilee, instantly baking the plateau. The Crusaders were desperate. Their only hope was to punch through the Muslim lines and reach the waters of the Sea of Galilee, visible as a tantalizing blue shimmer just a few miles away. But Saladin had prepared one final, devastating surprise. He had noted the direction of the wind. It was blowing from the west, pushing across the dry, scrub-covered plain directly toward the Crusader lines. Saladin gave the order. Hundreds of Muslim skirmishers rushed forward with torches. They set fire to the dry grass and scrub. Brush, the effect was instantaneous. A wall of flame and choking, black smoke rolled over the Christian army. The heat, already oppressive from the sun and the armor, became unbearable. The smoke blinded the knights, burned their lungs, and hid the Muslim archers who poured volleys of arrows into the gray haze. The Crusaders were fighting not just an army, but the elements: thirst, heat, smoke, steel. The discipline of the European armies relied heavily on the coordination between the mounted knights and the foot soldiers. The infantry protected the horses from arrows. The knights provided the shock power, but thirst respects no rank. As the march attempted to resume towards the water, the Christian infantry, thousands of commoners, dehydrated and terrified, finally snapped. They ignored the orders of the king. They abandoned the knights, driven by a primal need for water. A massive foot soldiers broke formation and surged toward the horns of Hattin, the twin peaks that offered the only high ground. They hoped to find a defensive position, or perhaps a route to the lake. King Guy sent messengers, pleading with them to come down and protect the knights. The infantry refused. "We will not come down," they cried. "We are dying of thirst." This was the tactical end of the army. The knights were now exposed. Their horses were being slaughtered by the thousands by Muslim arrows. The wall of steel that had protected the kingdom for 80 years was stripped naked. Saladin saw the separation and closed the trap. His heavy cavalry drove a wedge between the Christian infantry on the peaks and the knights on the plateau. The knights were now surrounded on all sides. They fought with the desperation of doomed men. Reynald of Tripoli, commanding the vanguard, saw the disaster unfolding. He realized that the battle was lost. In a final, controversial act, he gathered his own household knights and launched a suicidal charge directly at the Muslim lines, blocking the road to Sipori, perhaps out of respect, or perhaps simply to let the dangerous old lion leave the trap. The Muslim commanders opened their ranks. Reynald's knights thundered through the gap and escaped the battlefield. Reynald rode away, weeping with shame, knowing he was leaving his king and his kingdom to die. He would die of pleurisy and a broken heart just weeks later. Back on the plateau, the situation was apocalyptic. King Guy, the Templars, and the remaining barons were compressed into a tight, chaotic ball around the red tent of the king. Beside the tent stood the most precious object in the Christian world, the true cross. It was mounted on a gold-covered wagon gleaming in the sun, a beacon of faith in the center of hell. The Templars and Hospitallers rallied around the cross. They fought like demons. They launched charge after charge against the encircling Muslims, trying to buy time, trying to find water. But the Muslim ring was made of iron. Saladin's Mamluks held firm, tightening the noose. The horses were dead. The knights were fighting on foot, tripping over the bodies of their comrades, gasping for air in the smoke-filled furnace of the plateau. They were not defeated by superior swordsmanship. They were defeated by the sun. Saladin watched from a nearby hill, his face impassive, his eyes fixed on the red tent. He knew that when that tent fell, Jerusalem would fall with it. The battle was no longer a contest of tactics. It was a slow, grinding slaughter of exhausted men who could barely lift their swords. The Lion of Islam had the Lamb of God in his jaws, and he was not going to let go. It was mid-afternoon on July 4th, 1187. The sun was high, a white-hot disk, burning through the haze of smoke and dust that choked the plateau of Hattin. What remained of the grandest army ever assembled by the Kingdom of Jerusalem was now compressed into a tiny, desperate pocket around the king's red tent. The infantry had been slaughtered or scattered on the slopes of the horns. The cavalry, the pride of Christendom, were unhorsed, exhausted, and dying of thirst. Yet they fought on, the Knights Templar and Hospitallers, realizing there would be no escape and no mercy, rallied for a final suicidal defense. Encased in steel that must have felt like an oven, they formed a shield wall around their king and their god. They launched charge after charge on foot. The Muslim chroniclers described the Franks fighting with the ferocity of cornered lions. They were driven not by hope of survival, but by the desire to take as many enemies with them as possible. Saladin, riding among his troops, tightened the noose. He ordered his archers to cease firing and his heavy cavalry, the Mamluks, to move in for the kill. The battle devolved into a gruesome close-quarters meat grinder. Swords against maces, daggers against mail, men grappling in the bloody dust. In the center of the swirling chaos stood the true cross. To the modern mind, it is difficult to understand the power of this object. To the Crusaders, it was not a symbol. It was a weapon. It was the physical wood upon which Christ had died, encased in gold and jewels. It was the Ark of the Covenant of the New Testament. They believed that as long as the cross stood, God was with them. The Bishop of Acre, wearing his ceremonial armor, held the cross aloft. Around him, the Templars fought with a fanatical desperation. They knew that if the cross fell, the kingdom fell. Saladin knew it too. He directed his fiercest commanders, including his nephew Taqi al-Din, to shatter the Christian center and seize the relic. The fighting around the wagon holding the cross was the fiercest of the age. Wave after wave of Muslim soldiers threw themselves at the Templar shield wall. The noise was deafening, the screams of men, the clash of steel, and the prayers of the dying. Finally, the Bishop of Acre fell, pierced by arrows. The guard was broken. The Muslim soldiers swarmed over the wagon. A great cry went up from the Christian ranks, a sound of utter spiritual despair. The true cross was captured. To the Crusaders, this was not just a military defeat. It was a divine judgment. God had abandoned them. With the cross gone, the remaining morale evaporated. The surviving knights were pushed back until they were huddled against the ropes of the king's red tent. Saladin's young son, Al-Afdal, who was witnessing his first battle at his father's side, watched the desperate scene. Years later, Al-Afdal recorded the moment when the king of the Franks retreated to the hill. His knights made a gallant charge and drove the Muslims back. I looked at my father and saw he was pale and agitated. Then the Muslims rallied and drove the Franks back to the hill. I shouted, "We have beaten them." But my father turned to me and said, "Be quiet. We have not beaten them until that tent falls." Saladin knew the tenacity of the Western Knights. As long as the king's banner flew, they would fight, but the end was inevitable. The Muslim troops, energized by the capture of the cross, launched a final, overwhelming assault. They cut the guy ropes of the royal pavilion. The great red tent collapsed into the dust. Saladin, seeing the tent fall, dismounted from his horse. He knelt on the rocky ground and bowed his head to the earth in a prayer of thanks. He wept with relief. The war was won. By late afternoon, the fighting had ceased. The silence that descended on the plateau of Hattin was heavier than the noise of battle. the carnage was absolute. Of the 20,000 Christian soldiers who had marched from Sepharia, perhaps 3,000 escaped. The rest were dead or captured. The flower of the Crusader nobility lay in piles of broken armor. The entire field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had been erased from existence in a single day. The survivors were rounded up. They were parched, burned, wounded, and terrified. Among them were the highest prizes of the war: King Guy of Lusignan, the Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Rydfort, and the hated Reynald of Châtillon. They were stripped of their armor and weapons and dragged towards Saladin's tent. The King of Jerusalem was now a prisoner of the King of the Iyyubids. It is hard to overstate the magnitude of Hattin. In the history of medieval warfare, rarely has a defeat been so total. The military order, the Templars and Hospitallers, had lost almost every fighting knight in the Holy Land. The nobility, almost every baron, lord, and castle commander was captured or killed. The defenses, because King Guy had issued the Araban, the castles and cities behind them were empty. There were no garrisons left to defend Jerusalem, Acre, or Calon. The door to the Holy Land was not just unlocked, it had been torn off its hinges. As the sun set on July 4th, the surviving Crusaders were tied together with ropes. Saladin ordered that the true cross be carried upside down, a symbol of the triumph of Islam over Christianity. But for the leadership of the crusade, the night was not over. Saladin had one final debt to pay: a vow of vengeance he had sworn against the man who started it all. Inside the victor's pavilion, a final, bloody drama was about to play out. The sun finally set on the plateau of Hattin, plunging the field of carnage into a merciful darkness. The screams of the dying were slowly replaced by the triumphant chants of the Muslim soldiers and the clinking of chains. In the center of the Muslim camp, a magnificent pavilion was erected for the victor. Saladin sat within, surrounded by his generals and his victorious Mamluk guard. He was exhausted, covered in the dust of battle, but filled with a profound sense of divine purpose. He had achieved what no Muslim leader had done in a century. He had shattered the armies of the cross. Now, the prisoners of highest rank were brought before him. King Guy of Lusignan and Reynald of Châtillon were dragged into the tent. They were in a pitiful state, armor battered, faces blackened with smoke, lips cracked and bleeding from extreme dehydration. They had not tasted water in nearly 24 hours. They stood before the man who now held the power of life and death over the entire Kingdom of Jerusalem. What followed is a scene recorded by both Christian and Muslim chroniclers, a moment of high drama where the laws of desert hospitality dictated the fate of nations. Saladin looked at King Guy. He saw a man broken by fear and thirst. The Sultan, moved by a momentary grace, or perhaps simply adhering to the custom that a king should treat a king with dignity, ordered a cup of iced rosewater, cooled with snow brought from Mount Hermon, to be given to Guy. Guy seized the cup. He drank greedily, the cold liquid shocking his parched throat, but he did not finish it. In a gesture of camaraderie, or perhaps naive hope, Guy handed the half-empty cup to Reynald of Châtillon. Reynald raised the cup to his lips. Suddenly, Saladin's voice cut through the silence like a whip. He spoke to his interpreter, pointing a shaking finger at Reynald. "Tell the king, it is he who has given this man to drink, not I." The meaning was lethal. In Arab custom, to give a prisoner food or water is to grant him protection, a guarantee that his life will be spared. By refusing to claim the gift of water for Reynald, Saladin was publicly declaring, "There is no protection for this man. He is already dead." Saladin dismissed the terrified King Guy to a corner of the tent. He then turned his full terrifying attention to Reynald of Châtillon. For years, Saladin had waited for this moment. He listed Reynald's crimes: the breaking of the truce, the slaughter of the pilgrims, the raid on the Red Sea, and finally, the supreme insult, the blasphemy against the Prophet Muhammad. "I swore a vow," Saladin reportedly said that if I ever held you in my power, I would sever your head myself. Reynald, true to his nature, remained defiant to the end. Even bound and kneeling, he refused to beg. He reportedly replied, "This is the way of kings. I played a great game and I lost." Saladin drew his scimitar. With a single violent motion, he struck Reynald on the shoulder, cutting deep into his neck. The Mamluk guards immediately stepped forward and finished the job. Hacking the Baron's head from his body, they dragged the corpse out of the tent by its feet, leaving a trail of blood across the rich carpets. King Guy, watching the butchery of his most powerful vassal, began to shake uncontrollably. Convinced he was next, Saladin turned to him, sheathed his sword, and spoke the words that defined his reputation for chivalry. "A king does not kill a king, but that man went too far." Reynald of Châtillon, the Wolf of Kerak, was dead. But Saladin's work was not finished. There was another group of men who had survived the battle, men he considered far more dangerous than any rogue baron. The next morning, July 5th, 1187, Saladin ordered a grim assembly. He commanded that all the surviving Knights Templar and Hospitallers be separated from the other prisoners. While ordinary knights could be ransomed for gold and foot soldiers could be sold into slavery, Saladin viewed the military orders as an incurable cancer. He knew their vows. He knew they would never stop fighting. If he released them, they would simply find new horses, new armor, and return to the war. There was no reforming a Templar. They were, in his words, firebrands that had to be extinguished. Approximately 230 Templar and Hospitaller knights had been captured alive. Saladin ordered them brought to a small hill outside the camp. Saladin did not assign this task to his regular soldiers. Instead, in a chilling display of religious fervor, he invited the Sufis, scholars, and religious volunteers who followed his army to perform the executions. These were men of the book, not men of the sword, but they clamored for the privilege of slaying the infidel monsters. It was a grotesque, chaotic scene. The chronicler Ahmed ad-Din, who was present, described it with a mixture of horror and awe. He wrote that some of the executioners were skilled and killed their victims cleanly, while others hacked clumsily at the kneeling knights, requiring multiple blows to sever the heads. The Templars and Hospitallers, true to their strict discipline, knelt silently. They did not beg. They did not struggle. They viewed martyrdom as the ultimate fulfillment of their vows. They died as they had lived, stubborn, silent, and unified. By noon, the flower of the Christian military elite lay headless in the dust of Galilee. The Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Rydfort, was spared, perhaps because Saladin knew that a leader as incompetent as Gerard was more useful to the Muslims alive than dead. But his order was decimated. With the execution of the orders and the capture of the king, the military power of the Latin Kingdom was effectively erased. Saladin wasted no time. He swept through the kingdom like a tidal wave. Acre surrendered without a fight. Sidon, Beirut, and Ashkelon fell in rapid succession. The castles, stripped of their garrisons to fight at Hattin, threw open their gates. There was no one left to stop him. The army of the kingdom was a pile of bones on the horns of Hattin. Saladin turned his eyes toward the ultimate prize, the goal of his entire life, the city that had been in Christian hands for 88 years. He marched on Jerusalem. Inside the holy city, there were no knights left to lead the defense. There were only women, children, refugees, and one nobleman who had escaped the slaughter at Hattin Balian of Ibelin. The stage was set for the final siege. But unlike the bloodbath of the First Crusade, the fall of Jerusalem would prove to be a complex dance of negotiation, threat, and mercy, a final testament to the new order Saladin had imposed upon the world. On September 20th, 1187, Saladin's army laid siege to Jerusalem. The city was packed with refugees, but devoid of soldiers. The defense fell to Balian of Ibelin, a nobleman who had escaped Hattin. Balian managed to knight every boy of noble birth over the age of 16 and organized a desperate defense on the walls. But without a professional field army to relieve them, the situation was hopeless. After weeks of bombardment and mining, the walls were breached. But unlike the First Crusade in 1099, where the Christian conquerors had waded through ankles-deep blood, Saladin chose a different path. On October 2nd, 1187, symbolically the anniversary of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, Jerusalem surrendered. Saladin allowed the Christians to ransom themselves. Those who could pay walked free to the coast. Those who could not were enslaved, though Saladin and his brother famously freed thousands out of charity. The cross on the dome of the rock was taken down, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was purified with rose water, and the call to prayer rang out over the city once more. 88 years of Christian rule in Jerusalem had ended, brought down not by the walls, failing, but by the decision to march into the desert. At 8ttn. News of the catastrophe at Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem struck Europe like a thunderbolt. It is said that Pope Urban III died of shock upon hearing the news. The defeat did not end the Crusades. It ignited the greatest one of all. The monarchs of Europe, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, took the cross in response. The Third Crusade would arrive to find a changed map. They would retake Acre and secure the coast, ensuring the Crusader presence survived for another century. But they would never retake Jerusalem. The spinal cord of the kingdom, the manpower lost at Hattin, could never be fully replaced. The Crusaders were forced to cling to the coast, a maritime trading state rather than a kingdom of the interior. The Battle of Hattin remains the most decisive military engagement in the history of the Crusades. It was a masterclass in strategy by Saladin and a masterclass in incompetence by the Christian leadership. It cemented the image of Saladin in the West as the chivalrous infidel, a reputation that persists to this day. For the Knights Templar, Hattin was a disaster from which they barely recovered. While the order grew wealthy again, they never shook the reputation of arrogance that Gerard de Rydford had earned them. Their annihilation at Hattin foreshadowed their eventual total destruction by the French king a century later. The horns of Hattin still stand today, silent sentinels over the Sea of Galilee. They mark the spot where thirst, pride, and a single day of bad judgment changed the religious map of the world forever. Thank you for listening to the true story of Hattin, the day the Knights Templar fell to the sword on history by blood, a UDIOBOOK. If this deep dive into the most catastrophic day of the Crusades captivated you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing you unique, long-form historical audiobooks. Let us know in the comments below. Do you blame the fall of the kingdom on the recklessness of Reynald of Châtillon or the weakness of King Guy?